So I think what we'll do is we'll get started. Most of you probably know this is Dennis Small from OSPI, Educational Technology, and he's going to give us an overview and some ways to implement the new EdTech standards in Washington State.
All right, thank you. All right, so just curiosity, how many of you are from Washington State? I know Carla's not. All right, anybody else from out not in Washington State? Since we're in Oregon, yeah, good. And how about in terms of role? How many people are kind of the IT or network person? Some of you are going to raise your hands 3 or 4 times, I know. More on the instructional side, the EdTech side? Okay. Both, yeah. Any teacher librarians in the room? All right. Any administrators in the room? All right. Good. So good cross-section. So just so you know, all the things that I present, I have a Moodle that has all the different PowerPoints and stuff, and our agency has adopted an open policy. So we are putting a CC BY license on everything, which basically means you have absolute permission to download them, repurpose them, put your name on them, change them any way you want, and reuse them any way you want if it's helpful. So just want to mention that because sometimes that's a nice resource, and then hopefully that means you don't have to take quite as copious notes if you're going to, because you can access it all later on anyway. All right, well, let me get this baby started here. Okay. Oh, yeah. Oof. Boy, a minute there. All right, so first of all, we started updating our standards. Well, let me back up even further. Back in 2007, our state legislature said, you know, we originally thought we'd have technology embedded in all the different standards when they came out in the 90s. And depending on the standards, that didn't always work. So let's create some EdTech standards specifically. So they directed our office to do that. And in 2008, we came out with our first EdTech standards, which basically were around 2 big buckets of technology integration into subject areas and something we called digital citizenship, which was way before anybody was really calling things digital citizenship, so it may or may not have resonated with folks at that time. And so this past year, starting about the summer of 2017, we realized that it's half past high time to update those, since 2008 was a long time ago technologically. And some of the things that we refer to probably don't even exist anymore. I didn't find MySpace in there, but I did find some other things that have long gone. So we put together a variety of educator teams to help us with the update process. And hello, sir. Several of them are in the room here, in fact. We managed to have about 50 educators help us over the course of the summer, look at kind of what was out there, think about, do we want to update our current standards, which direction we want to go. And by the end of the summer, the strong recommendation, and the one that we ended up going with, was saying there's already some really outstanding standards that the International Society for Technology and Education, or ISTE, put together back in 2016, and that many of our districts were already using anyway. Thank you very much, way ahead of the state. And why not go with those? And so that was indeed the direction that we chose. The official adoption will happen on May 18th, so coming up real soon now. We're going to have a ceremony down in Vancouver Public Schools at Skyview High School, and the superintendent of public instruction, potentially the governor's office, and some folks from ISTE will be there to help us kick it all off. But spoiler alert, you already know what they are. They're the 2016 ISTE standards. And so we started with the performance indicators and the standards from ISTE. And by the way, a lot of folks, I'm going to pass this around because further back in the booklet here, you'll see that even though the performance indicators that are listed there sound like they're for all grades, they are not. They are actually the grades 9 through 12 ones, and they have separate, much more grade appropriate and age appropriate versions of those for the K through 2, 3 through 5, and 6 through 8 grade bands. So one of the things I want to alert you to, if you've seen the ISTE standards but then thought, gee, those sound an awful lot like they're pretty advanced for some of my kids, yeah, they are, because it's intended for the 9th through 12th grade performance indicators that are listed under those, and there are separate ones for different grade bands and ages listed elsewhere. We made the intentional decision to do a verbatim adoption of those, as with Common Core, which no one ever says anymore, right? It's the state standards, right? We don't have the national standards. But as with Common Core, the discussion was, do you take them face value verbatim, or do you tweak them a little bit? And there are certainly a few of the wordings that we would love to have tweaked. On the other hand, as soon as you do that, then you're out of sync with other states, which there are already 2 that are adopting them, and there are now 6 that are looking at adopting them. I believe Oregon is among considering those as well. And then you've just put yourself out of sync with trying to do great partnerships in terms of, well, if they develop resources that are aligned to this one, why can't we use it? Absolutely we can, as long as we don't tinker with the wording. So we made that conscious decision to go specifically as is on the ISTE standards, but we tried to add some kind of value adds for Washington State, which again, hopefully can be helpful to other states as well. So first of all, notice it says samples of student performance. This is not intended to be an all-inclusive checklist. This is not included to be, this is what you have to do to show that you're doing it. This is really more, if a teacher's having a challenge wrapping their head around what might it look like in the classroom, just a sample of what that would be. So that's a piece of what you'll see in the final document. Boy, it seems weird to say document these days, since it's probably going to be downloaded electronically. For most people, you may not even actually see a document. But in the final document, there will be samples of student performance for each of the performance indicators. And then what I think may well be the biggest value add for a lot of folks when they're thinking about integration and implementation is we had the educators that are working with us on this go through all the different standards. So these are our Washington State ELA, which happens to be Common Core verbatim, but again, we don't ever say that outside of this room, and our Washington State Math Standards, which again are verbatim from Common Core, and our Washington State Science Standards, which are next-gen science standards. And are there places where there are logical connections at about the same grade level and that have a similar match in cognitive demand, so that you could realistically say, if you're going to be teaching about this science standard, here's a place where you could connect it and be teaching about this tech standard at the same time. It's far too easy to just kind of check off the list and say, well, that has the same word, so it must be, a good match. But you really want to dig down deep and say, can I, with a straight face, say that if I taught this particular topic in science, math, or whatever else, actually be paying attention to this technology standard, whether it's research kinds of things or whatever else it might be. And so you'll find those throughout there. We looked at English language arts, math, science, the C3 framework, which is kind of becoming the new social studies framework. We also looked at our state social standards. We also looked at physical education. We looked at the AASL and found ourselves in a quandary because they had come out about 10 years ago as well, and then they came out with the new ones, which cost you $99 to get a full copy of. Don't get me started on that one. In any case, so we decided to punt for now, and we are going to come back and revisit the AASL once they're kind of more fleshed out in terms of what the new standards mean. So this is a school librarian standard from ALA, American Library Association. And also, the other thing that we started down the path of and decided to wait for now, but that will be one of our works in progress for this next year, is alignment with the TPEP frameworks. And again, I think it's a really nifty idea, but it's one of those that you really need to take some careful time, because there are 3 TPEP frameworks in our state. So TPEP is our teacher, principal, evaluation, what's the P? Program, thank you. All right, and so it's something that all of our schools are paying attention to in terms of, teacher growth and principal growth. And so to the extent we can connect that with the standards, we certainly want to do that. But again, we don't want to do that in a real superficial way that just says, well, any of these could fit if you figured it out the right way kind of thing. The last one here was a request from any number of districts for something that OSPI never, ever, ever does. So we'll say it with a really careful framing here as I describe it. It is a sample for optional use, scope and sequence, that districts can choose to use or not use or adopt or not adopt that might be helpful to some of them. Is that enough backing off of that? Because the reality is, in terms of kind of how our fiercely local control state works, and I know it's very similar in Oregon, is that the Department of Education and the state establish the standards. They do not tell you what instructional materials to use or those kinds of things or what curricular things to be doing. That's local control. That's decided locally. Hands off. Don't go there. On the other hand, any number of folks said, do we really have to create it from scratch? There's some great kind of pieces of that already out there. Can't we at least have a sample that people could use as a possible starting place if they choose to? So that's what you'll see in the document. It is basically actually a continuation of work that started in Nebraska when Common Core was just new, and they were kind of looking at how do I align, in those days, the 2000 was the ISTE NETs, 2007? Thank you. Yeah, 2007 ISTE NETs to that. And then as Common Core came out and then Next Gen Science kind of got layered in, so you may have seen it from Long Beach School District down in California, or Fresno Unified down in California. Spokane Public Schools in our state picked it up and did some work aligning it with that. Then Federal Way, not coincidentally, one of the tech person from Federal Way moved to, from Spokane moved to Federal Way, took it a step further. Anyway, we have used all that because it's all Creative Commons licensed, and extended that to say, how do we make that aligned with the ISTE standards? And so again, to the extent that it might be useful to you, please feel free to make use of that if you choose to. All right. Questions before we go on to the meat of what we're here for? All right. So if you haven't seen the ISTE standards from 2016, and hopefully most of you have, what is really amazing about them, and what I like the most, is that they're very aspirational. They don't get into nuts and bolts of how am I going to do this process or things like that. They're really thinking about how do I empower learners? How do I make sure that really we're teaching digital citizenship? How do I help kids be innovative designers? If you could strip away the word technology and the word digital from this, you could probably get almost every teacher that you work with, except maybe those are going to retire next year, to say, yeah, that's what I want from all of my kids. Those are things I care about. Now, as soon as we put in technology, that makes it more complicated for some of them. But again, just in terms of, are those aspirations that we have for all of our students? Yeah, they really are. So that's one of the things I really like about this as a starting place. So what's new and different? These standards are very student-centric. Talk about a digital age learner. They really are trying to focus on kind of adaptive skills because we don't always know what they're going to need moving forward. Talk about the ways that technology can amplify or transform teaching and learning. Very visionary, talking about empowering connected learning, and kind of multimodal, so they have kind of different ways that students are engaging with technology. As part of our review process and getting ready to adopt them statewide, we had the opportunity to have public feedback. So for about 5 weeks, we had a survey available, actually several different flavors of survey available. I had 110 individuals from around the state, which was actually a pleasant surprise, that accessed those and downloaded them to consider giving feedback. 60 of those, which tended to be educators, provided some level of feedback, and 39 provided some very detailed feedback. And so just want to share with you a little bit of what they came back in terms of strengths and concerns and suggestions and implementation ideas, because some of them were pretty brilliant. All right, so in terms of strengths, some of them are obvious. Connection to national standards, people like that. So these were the most commonly listed strengths, by the way. Forward thinking, building future leaders, connections and examples to help people visualize them. Certainly the encouragement of integration across there. And then people framed it different ways, but these kept coming up in terms of, yeah, those are things we really want for our kids. We're glad those are in the standards. So The next one there is one that maybe Carla can help me figure out, because 21st century skills were great when it was, 1995 and 2000 even, and we were thinking about that. What do we call them these days? I mean, people still do think of it in terms of that, and we still want those skills, collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking, but we need a new name for that. Anyway, so if anybody has a great thought on that.
I use modern age or digital age rather
Okay.
than 21st century.
Yeah.
We're 18% of the way into the.
Oh, I know, and that's
century.
isn't that the crazy part? Yeah. I mean, how far are we going to need to get into it before?
Some of those skill sets are the same, but they've evolved a little.
Yes, they have. Yeah. And indeed, for example, computational thinking did not show up in our 2008 standards at all. I mean, that was really a totally new piece that when I did the crosswalk back to what we already had, there's no placeholder for that. We just didn't pick that one up at all at that point. They're very comprehensive. There's a lot of rigor in them. Easily leads to I can statements. I thought that was a great insight. The whole idea of kids having responsibility for their learning, so there are some really fine kind of opportunities to think in terms of digital portfolios and personal learning goals, and then strong visions for parents and educators. Then concerns. We had some, and indeed they match ones that I would name probably as well. So certainly one of them is equity. And it's interesting. We just completed, by the way, our statewide survey of technology in the schools. We have over 1 million, that's 1 million with an M, instructional devices out there in schools right now for just over 1.1 million students. So we're very, very, very close to having almost one-to-one access within our school. Now, does that mean every kid does? Absolutely not. Does that mean they're all useful devices? Absolutely not. Does that mean all of our teachers know how to use them appropriately? Not necessarily either. So that's still a concern, but interestingly enough, it's less about is the stuff there than is it being used in powerful ways so that kids have an opportunity to use it in learning. So it's kind of pivoting a little bit, and yet it's still very much an issue in terms of equity, that you could go in some of our schools through an entire elementary school if you had a certain set of teachers and maybe not use technology maybe other than online tests and stuff like that.
Well, in Oregon and Washington as well, it's not just the digital tools, it's the access to the connectivity.
Oh, yes, sure. Yeah, although, again, in terms of connectivity, every one of our schools has broadband except for there are 6 individual buildings and one school, Stehekin, that's chosen not to enter the 21st century, and one school, Damon, that has a DSL modem connection for 40 kids. And other than that, everybody else has broadband in our state. So we're actually in an amazing shape that way. And yet, again, that doesn't mean there's always equity of usage and stuff like that. Professional development, huge challenge, and I don't think any of us would argue with that one. Some thought they were a little too lofty or too complex, which is interesting.
Trying to get my head around what is not in a quick teacher-friendly.
I was wondering that too.
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, these are the most common ones. So we had like 3 that mentioned something around that. So I tried to put them together, but
I'm not sure what that means.
yeah. Well, and I think they're talking about maybe at the performance indicator level, because certainly at the highest level, those are quick and easy to figure out. An empowered learner, yeah, I can visualize that, and I know what I want with my kids for that. But anyway,
I think what they want is a cookbook approach.
Yeah, and again, that's why I'm being careful even with the samples that we're doing, that we have to make sure that we're communicating those are not exhaustive and, here's all the answers, just check those off and you've caught it all. Challenge, local implementation, what are the teeth behind it? So in our state, there is actually a requirement around educational technology. For some of you, that may be a bit of a surprise. In Goal 3 of our Basic Education Act, it specifically calls out technology literacy and fluency as one of the things that every school ought to be doing. Okay?
How many districts are reporting that?
So on the latest survey, in terms of student technology standards, I think I had 170 out of 295 that report they have student standards, and of those, 110 actually test those or assess those. So roughly just over half. Yeah. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean they're not teaching it. It just means that they don't have formalized standards. Flip side, just because they have formalized standards doesn't mean they are teaching it. So it's still a fair question. But again, it is a challenge and one that we need to continue to address. And part of it has to do with leadership in terms of their understanding of it. So when I look at districts that are doing a lot with educational technology, it's a vision from the board and from the superintendent and its principals that are really moving that forward. Yeah. Certainly the integrating in the subject areas, that's a concern, but I think it's a strength as well, because it's when they're done PowerPoint only for PowerPoint's sake that it's not very useful to folks. It needs to be in the context of, I want to do that so that I can present in social studies or in science or whatever that way. And then just what's already on teachers' plates and how much time it takes. Yeah, that's a big challenge. Then we get into some of the suggestions. So some of those are things that I need to take to heart and be thinking about for this next year. So training at all levels with some webinars and videos and guidance. The nice part is, again, by the fact that we've got other states that are adopting these and more that will, there'll be opportunities for us to share some of that burden as well, because if you've ever tried to put together a really high-quality video, it's not easy or cheap, and so to the extent we can get videos from other places that we can share with one another, I think that'll be really helpful. Funding for technology materials, that's an interesting and always ongoing challenge. Now, again, in our state, there is funding for technology in the formula that drives out your MSOC, your materials, supplies, and operating costs. It's about $135, I think, and change per student this year, which is dramatically better than zero.
Because we've all seen that.
Yeah, we have all seen that. Yeah, and that's
We're still seeing that.
well, yeah, and so here's the reality check here. That's a funding formula that drives money out. That is not a formula that says thou shalt spend $135 per student. Now, that's a good conversation to have with your school board and your leadership if they're not spending somewhere close to that on technology. But again, it's not mandated by the fact it's driven out that way. It's just a placeholder for money that goes out. But again, it's still an amazing turnabout from even 5 years ago, when part of the reason they didn't ask for EdTech Standards until 2008 is they were worried they might have to pay for it. So, all right. Concrete examples of integrating in different academic areas? Absolutely. This is certainly one that we're already beginning to gather some of those things, and that will be a continued emphasis in the next couple of years, is to really share with one another what kind of best practices or successful practices, however you want to frame that, of how can you make it work in different areas. Sample lessons, ideas of a shared database or some kind of portal for that. And then we've started that process in terms of the connection to other standards, but again, crosswalk documents that help. We're also at least exploring some kind of online tool, so you could say I'm doing math and I'm doing science and I want to involve technology. How do I connect it? Where does it make sense? And then maybe some sample lessons that would go with that. So, other suggestions? Yeah, training or planning days. Yeah, okay. Links to free and vetted accessible online resources, and notice that they included accessible in that. I thought that was very appropriate, since that's certainly on a lot of people's minds these days. Training for leadership on how to support implementation. I think that's going to be a key one for us as well, and that's something we're working on. And then maybe some rubric tools or different kinds of things for evaluating the integration of technology. And again, there's some great possibilities already within that. Questions or thoughts while we're at that point? So, in terms of kind of implementation ideas, we got a lot of great feedback. Certainly, there were kind of themes that emerged from that. So one of them certainly is around professional learning about standards, and I'll share with you some more details on each of these as we go through. The whole idea of sharing tech integration lesson ideas, working within frameworks of either STEM or project-based or problem-based learning, connecting it to the work around digital citizenship and media literacy that's going on, looking at some of the integration models like SAMR and TPAC and T3. And I'll explain those in case those are new acronyms to you as we go forward. And then connections to FutureReady, which I know a lot of our districts are, at least at the superintendent level, looking into being involved with. So professional learning about standards. So one thing that was certainly highlighted, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, so this is not the folks that need to hear this, but you can go back and say that the state recognizes this important. The importance of somebody at the building level leadership that can really help lead the discussion. So it could be your principal, could be your curricular leader, could be a TOSA or tech specialist, teacher librarian, but somebody that can kind of be the focal point for having some really deep discussions within the curricular folks there about the standards. And so one idea that I know that a couple districts mentioned that they have been doing already is that they form PLCs, and that every month they'll pick a different standard and talk about how might they implement that within their grade band or within their subject area, and then kind of reflect back and share how that went. Another idea, and this is one that I know Vancouver school districts use with their school board, and some other folks have as well, is get away from the technology for a minute and just have people visualize what would it look like to have an empowered learner. And you could do this at a faculty meeting, you could do this through your school board, either as a PTA or PTSA meeting, and maybe have them do it, with drawing tools or things like that. So kind of set the tech aside, and so you could do it with ideas that you put on stickies and organize it that way. You could have people, they actually had them drawing figures without saying a word about it, which was an interesting approach already, of what they visualized an empowered learner looks like, and 10 years from now, and then shared that and reflected on that, and used that as a jumping off place for then looking at the standards to say, okay, what are some of the attributes that we need to be addressing in terms of kids' readiness to be an empowered learner. We also got a variety of great suggestions. So as I mentioned, this is kind of going to be our starting place for a repository of lesson ideas and things like that. So some folks in their feedback went into a specific performance indicator. So that in this case, it's 2B, where kids are engaging in positive, safe, legal, and ethical behavior. And so this is at grade 3 through 5. Yeah. No, this is 6 through 8, sorry. And so students create newscasts that promote ethical use of technology as they publish it, and they model ethical use of social media through tweets. Wow. Your middle school doing that? Yeah, pretty cool stuff. Or how the kids put set up the norms for online discussions or blogs. And then this next one is 9 through 12 examples. So for 3D, and very different approaches to having kids working with real-world problems. So one of them applies it to mathematics and having kids take aerial pictures. In fact, in their full description, they thought about maybe having drones and sending them out to get aerial photos to use in the classroom. But for example, challenges that come from real-world things, in this case, the fact that Broadway goes right through the middle of New York City, and what impact that has on that part. Probably you could pick that for your larger street in one of your bigger cities as well. And then have kids create ticketing systems to support real-world problems and keep track of those that way. So some interesting things, and again, there were dozens of these implementation ideas that came forward in the recommendations. Then thinking in terms of specific opportunities, so if you have a STEM initiative, or if you're using project-based learning or problem-based learning, and they are different, but they sound a lot the same. But the whole idea is that technology can be part of the lesson design, so that you really can, as you're thinking about a hands-on lesson in one of these areas, have technology be just built into it, and then have ways that students can go deeper in their learning using the technology and or solve problems or access information in ways that they couldn't before. So whether it's having students do a survey of a contemporary problem in their community and bring information back that way, or any number of different ways that that might be carried out. The whole idea is giving students a voice in a way that they didn't have before, and also giving them a choice at entry point. So too often in a lot of our classroom settings, we kind of give them one size fits all, and for a lot of kids, if they can, even if it's within a fairly finite universe, if we can give them their choice of where they enter that universe, can be really powerful for them. Another piece that certainly is top of mind in our state, because digital citizenship and media literacy has been a point of emphasis from our legislature, is the opportunity to connect that. Not uncoincidentally, Standard 2 talks about digital citizen, but if you also look at Standards 1 and 3 and 4, the whole issues around media literacy and techniques that come with that are called out. So we did a legislative report a couple years ago on digital citizenship, and again, as you look at some of the recommendations here, they fit really nicely with the new standards, and would provide a really nice way for people to kind of tie back and say, okay, if you're talking about cyberbullying, here's an opportunity to be addressing this standard and so forth. So there's a whole series of recommendations from there that again, hopefully can help provide a different point of entree. So if you care about digital citizenship and media literacy, but you're squeamish about technology, this might be a way to kind of tiptoe into it in terms of ways the technology can support that learning and so forth. All right, acronym alert here. So there are 3 different models. Actually, there's way more than 3, but these are probably 3 of the most powerful and commonly used ones these days that really speak to kind of, are there ways to help people visualize kind of the growth that happens in the way that technology is used in the classroom. So one of them is called the SAMR model. How many of you have heard SAMR before? Yeah, most of you. Okay. So the idea here is that in general, first time people dip their toe in the water with technology, it tends to be the same sort of activity they were already doing, but with technology substituting for that. So think in terms of, I'm going to do a worksheet, and now I'm going to do a digital worksheet. Or I'm going to do typing up paper or things like that, and now I'm going to use the word processor. We're going to look for information in the dictionary and encyclopedia. Now we're going to look for it online. And really basic stuff, but for a lot of folks, that's the kind of the first point of comfort level, because it's something they're familiar with and it fits their locus of control as well. So in that situation, the teacher is pretty much still the sage on the stage, if you will, and you haven't really changed much other than the way in which it's delivered. Augmentation is the idea of we can still do the same thing, but we can improve that. So maybe with the word processing, if we do it within a Google Doc, we can have kids do peer review of one another and then submit it to the teacher that way. So it's still kind of teacher-centric, but we have a little bit of functional improvement augmentation happening to it. Modification is the idea of really changing or transforming it to a different kind of task. And if you've worked with any teacher librarians and other folks that deal with online searches, this is a fascinating area, because for a lot of teachers, until they realize the need for this, they're going to have to spend most of their time worrying about if kids are copying and pasting when they go to look up answers to stuff, because they're probably asking the wrong kind of questions. So these days, it's so easy to go find, XYZ on whatever subject. So if your assignment still says, come back and tell me everything about that, as opposed to what do you think about that, or what conclusions you have, or how would you compare those, or which one of those is more important, then you're going to be frustrated by the technology. In fact, see it as a burden as opposed to an opportunity. So once we get into modification, then we really are talking about saying, oh, we can do something totally different with technology, or get to a place in terms of what we care about kids' thinking processes that we wouldn't necessarily have gotten to otherwise. Redefinition is kind of this leap into the unknown. So maker spaces, a variety of other kinds of things where kids are really getting the opportunity to be creative and doing different things that just weren't possible before we got the technology available. So that's the SAMR model. That's one. Notice that SAMR really, in my mind, focuses around how do you make it engaging for students. So if you're kind of comparing the different models that I'll show you here, I think about SAMR in terms of student engagement, kind of what's the level of engagement, kind of going from fairly modest to really engaged. Now, the other thing to note, and this is really important to those of you who work with professional learning, is that this is not a value judgment about this is way better than that, and that anybody who's doing this is, a loser. In most cases, it's a continuum that people grow through, and so it's really more of a growth model than anything else. And there are times when you're still going to use technology as a substitute. So if I'm having a kid learn their times table, it may well be that some kind of technology program that does kind of a flashcard thing, which is just a basic substitute, is still a very effective and efficient way to do that. In fact, if I gamify it, it might be more interesting for the kid, or in terms of learning a keyboard or something. So it's not that that's always bad or wrong. It's just that in terms of student engagement, tends to get stronger as we move down here and changes kind of the locus control. The TPACK model is more about kind of what's effective. So it has kind of domains of things. So we've got content knowledge, we've got technological knowledge, and we've got pedagogical knowledge. I'm not going to try to go into great detail on that, but I just want you to kind of at least be aware of this, because this is one that talks more about effective integration. And so in many cases, even if you're, back to the SAMR model, doing some real kind of change of your activity, you may not be doing it in a very effective way. And so this one really talks about what do we know about learning theory that makes for effective instruction with the use of technology. So it gets really more into the brain research and some of the other kind of underlying things that fit into that whole methodology.
Dennis, I think the TPACK model is, when you're talking about professional development,
yes,
and designing professional development, this is essential.
Yes.
Because you may have a teacher who's a phenomenal biology teacher, but is kind of a tech phobe. They need to have both the content, yes, and the technology, and good pedagogy. And pedagogy shifts a little bit with technology, so they have to have an understanding of that to be effective.
Yes, yeah, and Carla's absolutely right. So again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but it's really important that everything we do in terms of using technology is grounded in pedagogy behind it, and in terms of student learning. And it's really easy to get caught up with isn't this a cool app, or gee, I've got one-to-one devices, so now I'm all set. And if you're not doing anything different than what you were before, then one-to-one devices won't change the outcomes dramatically. So yeah, that's very, very good thing. And again, this is the kind of thing that for folks that aren't as comfortable with the technology can help them to think about, how am I really designing the lesson in such a way that it is effective, and so that it meets kids' different learning styles, because that's another important piece of this whole thing is the opportunity to have visualization or different ways to reteach something that can happen with the technology that's really a powerful part of that. Then a third model that's fairly new. Any of you seen the T3 model? That's all right. Well, Sunny Magana, who actually was a teacher in Washington for many years at ACES High School in Mukilteo, and then went on to do a variety of other things, and now is doing some futurism and stuff in education, has a real intriguing model called the T3 Framework for Innovation. And so he's organized things in a slightly different way, but very, very interesting and thought-provoking. The book, officially, I should have that memorized, but I So it's called Disruptive Classroom Technologies, a Framework for Innovation in Education. Anyway, so this is another one. So again, if you're thinking about kind of ways that you might engage your teachers in thinking about changes in technology, pick one of these three. You don't have to do all three. In fact, you don't have to do any of the three, but some kind of thing that helps people to visualize the change that happens in the use of technology as a conversation starter is certainly something I'd recommend in terms of implementation strategies. So again, there's no one right answer here, but certainly the extent that we can help people really get the bigger picture that it's not about the stuff, it's about the learning that happens with that can be really powerful in terms of implementation. All right, so we're doing fine. Good. FutureReady. How many of your schools have signed on to FutureReady? Or your superintendents? Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. So I will make the appropriate caveat here. FutureReady, I think, is a great conversation starter, and it's a really thoughtful framework for what kinds of structures are needed in schools to prepare for the future. It has, in some cases, become a buzzword without much substance behind it, so I'll say that in full disclosure as well. But I think, again, any kinds of things, if your district is already looking at these are great conversation starters to say, okay, how do we connect the dots between the frameworks that are here and integration of technology? So if your district is one of those, or if you're looking at it, they have some really, really thoughtful, and again, is this going to solve everything in the world? No, but we'll start some good conversations. So what does a future-ready EdTech leader look like in terms of different things that should be on their plate, different things to be considering? Again, I've used this with some tech kind of roundtable discussions and just as a great kind of discussion starter, just in terms of our own practice and what are we focusing on and what are we a little weak on. And oftentimes it's the squeaky wheels that get our time, and so far too many tech folks in our state end up worrying about online assessment and some of the things that could go wrong, as opposed to really thinking about the holistic approach here. But again, a nice framework for what are some of the things that tech leaders should be thinking about, particularly as they look towards the future. Again, it's part of the challenge of being in tech, and again, you're all in it, so you already know that, is that everything keeps changing under your feet. So that's both the excitement and the beauty, and just drives you crazy. I mean, we were just talking in the last session just about kind of data privacy and the changing terms of service of different things, and how do you keep up with all that stuff. And whew, yeah. Anyway, so there's a framework for tech-ready EdTech leaders. Come on, you really do want to go there, please? Thank you. Okay, future-ready librarian. And again, depends on your district. Some of our districts have actually cut back on their library support. Other ones are beginning to dip their toe back into the water. In other cases, it's still a topic of kind of tension and stuff. But to the extent that teacher librarians can be leaders for information literacy in whatever way fits within your district, I think is a real powerful thing. And they are the experts about how to collate and curate information, and to the extent that we can put them in powerful ways to lead some of those discussions, and not just have them be the keeper of the books, but the more powerful it is for them that way. Yeah. Future-ready instructional coach. This is an interesting one. Again, not all our schools have this. And notice it doesn't say technology TOSA. This is talked about instructional coach in whatever subject area. So, again, it's a good conversation starter because it's not just about technology. And future-ready principal. Careful, those might be fighting words if you take it with the wrong group of principals, but on the other hand, it might be a great conversation starter for professional learning community of principals to think about. By the way, these are all publicly available if you're interested in using them. But went too far. All right, so what's coming next? Well, on May 18th, we'll adopt the new standards. As you know, that's really just the start of the story because it takes a long time. In fact, I would dare say there are places in our state in 2018 where you could go before we adopt the new standards and they wouldn't know that we had old standards. So I have no illusions about the task ahead. But just to let you know some of the things that are on the drawing board for the next year or two or three. So one of them that's very specific that we have a insurmountable opportunity, which is, by the way, spoiler alert for my state update coming up soon, is the opportunity to provide some pre-professional development through a partnership with the state library. So the state library gets grant funds, at least until the feds cut it off someday, which they thought they were going to last year, and they actually restored it, thank goodness. And so on July 25th, I'll be meeting with a cadre of teacher librarians to put together a 6-hour workshop that will deliver probably 15 to 20 times around the state as we did this past year in digital citizenship, and as they did the year before that in next gen science, and as they did before that in Common Core math and science, math and ELA. To focus on professional development to integrate technology. And so we're going to try to take some of these ideas and share ideas around the state and again, leverage that. It'll be primarily geared towards teacher librarians, but obviously be very appropriate for any sort of technology specialist or TOSA, open to anybody. So if you have principals or building leaders or superintendents that you want to come to that, if you can get them to actually show up for a whole day. So much better. We'll provide 6 free clock hours, so there's nice. Free is always a good price. So that's one piece that we'll be implementing for this coming year that I think will help at least in some part of the professional development need. We'll be doing probably every other month a webinar, and I'm toying with the idea of like a theme for the month. So digital citizenship obviously is an easy one because there's actually a digital citizenship week. I think it's second week in November, something like that. Anyway, I'll certainly know it by the time we get to that point. But again, wouldn't it be great, and this is something I'll talk about with some of my other state partners, is to say, wouldn't it be great if we had across any of the states that are using ISTE Standards to have kind of theme of the month, and it could be empowered learner for this one and digital citizen for another one, and have some video and kind of school examples of what they're doing with that. So one of the things I mentioned in the last session around digital citizenship is we've got a school in East Valley, Spokane that has student ambassadors, internet ambassadors that are kind of the thought leaders and discussion leaders for their high school implementation of digital citizenship. Wouldn't it be neat to feature some of them on that monthly webinar as kind of a role model for what other schools might consider, especially in terms of their high schools and stuff. So that's certainly something we're looking at. And then conference presentations, the obvious ones are things like this, but probably the more important ones are like the administrators conference and the school board conference and some of the content area conferences. So we'll be targeting some of those. And it probably won't be me doing it because it usually is the case that if they can hear from somebody that's actually doing it in the classroom, it's Carla knows that, she's nodding as well. You're wonderful to put up with me here, but it's usually better to hear from a teacher, and so I might partner with the teacher to get the conference thing approved, but I really am a believer that practitioners are the ones that people really like to hear from and stuff. As I mentioned, we'll be working on connecting to the American Library School Library Association standards. Our state is in the process of updating their social studies standards, so we'll be aligning with that as well. And then we'll be doing some work to align to TPET frameworks. Probably not well known yet, but in the next couple of months, as new professional development offerings are offered, there actually will be an opportunity to align those to specific TPEP parts of the framework so that people can actually know what it is they're going to be learning in that session and stuff. And so again, I think some really neat opportunities to not only from the tech standard side, but just in terms of the pedagogy that's going to be covered in some of the professional learning to help people to get a better sense of what, if I'm looking for growth in this area as a teacher, I can go to this workshop and have it really focus on that. So I think a neat possibility that way. Certainly we'll be exploring partnerships with ISTE and other states. So Connecticut and Vermont are the two states that have already adopted the standards. Texas has adopted the teacher standards and is promoting the student ones but hasn't officially adopted them. LA Unified has adopted the student standards. There are 6 states, I know Oregon is one of them, are currently in the process of looking to update their standards and are strongly considering the ISTE standards. So again, I think there'll be some neat opportunities for sharing among states and among areas that way in terms of resources that moves forward. We have a whole series of classroom-based assessments. If you are familiar with those, you probably know them best from their alignment with the social studies assessments. And given that the social studies standards will be updated, obviously we're going to be doing a dual update of that because the whole idea was that you'd be assessing technology and social studies at the same time. So we'll make sure that they're updated to reflect the new standards, both for social studies and for Washington State EdTech. Connections to digital citizenship and media literacy. As those of you who are patient tech folks in our state know, I'm asking you yet again for a survey. This time this is a legislative mandated survey on digital citizenship, media literacy, and internet safety education in the schools to find out what's really going on, because I don't think any of us really know. I think we just have anecdotal ideas that some places they're doing amazing stuff, and in some places they scare the kids once a year and call that internet safety. And so we have a state mandated survey this month to gather that information. But as that information comes back, I really want to make some direct connections both in the report to the legislature, but also recommendations to schools about how we can integrate these two. So it's, again, the standards specifically speak to digital citizen. They don't call it media literacy, but believe me, if you look at what media literacy is and what's in standards 1, 3, and 4, there are very, very strong connections to the components of media literacy that we can highlight and really support that way. And then kind of a last piece that we're exploring already and again, still trying to imagine for the future what that looks like, and is that something at the state level or at a regional level or at a national level, but forums to share ideas and lessons that again, we don't need to be reinventing the wheel. We've got lots of folks already doing some outstanding work with us, and to the extent we can leverage one another's work and share those, we want to make sure that we're doing that in whatever ways make sense. Questions? Covered a lot of stuff. Yeah?
When you did your alignment to
Yes.
different standards,
Yes.
did you look at the CSK-12 computer science standards?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Wow. Yes, and I forgot to mention that. Yes, that's absolutely. So very, very insightful question. So if you're not aware, our state just adopted computer science standards, which has confused the heck out of many, many people. Yeah, we did. And so absolutely we looked at those, and you'll see those embedded as well. And so two thoughts with that. One is that at the elementary level, what the ISTE/State EdTech Standards, or new ones as of May 18th, and what the elementary CS standards look like, has about a 90% alignment. I mean, it's incredibly powerful. That other than specific things like coding and some of the other things that are called out in the CS standards, most of the foundational stuff in terms of computational thinking, in terms of design thinking, in terms of a lot of the other kinds of things that are called out in both of them, align very, very nicely. And so part of our goal over the next year is to really help people to see those connections and then kind of do a gap analysis to say what are the specific areas that if you're paying attention to the EdTech standards, you still want to think about in terms of the CS standards. So coding is certainly a specific one of those that's called out there. As you get to higher grades, there's much more divergent, as you might imagine, because CS standards tend to be very, very specific around programming and things like that at the high school level. So there is a kind of a distancing between the two, if you will. But yes, we definitely included that.
Is there a
yeah.
sequence then for those CS standards as well?
There is a framework,
Okay.
and I hate to be a weasel on answers. I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud here. It is like a scope and sequence. The challenge I have is that it's a little bit too high level to really help you get in the weeds of what you'd want in scope and sequence. So, and that was kind of the same dance we had with our state tech standards. The samples and the performance indicators are a framework, but they don't really get to the nitty-gritty of what skill is it you're going to teach at this grade, for introducing it or developing it or perfecting it. And so the sample scope and sequence that we are providing in the sample is very specific about that, probably more so than you might want, because people want to introduce things at different grades and do things like that. So that's where you want to make changes to it. The CS1 has a framework for that, but it doesn't get as much into the weeds as you might want. So I think there's still some room for that. But I work closely with Shannon Thiessen at our office, and I know that's one of her things that she's thinking about too. And it's similar kind of approach to say, could we provide a sample that schools are using or that people are putting together that people could use as at least a jumping off point. So yeah, the framework is a start, but it will still require a heck of a lot of work on your part, and I'm hoping that over the next year or two that we can actually, either through national work or at least state work, have a similar kind of sample optional use scope and sequence, because again, people don't have the time to reinvent the wheel on that. They really need, again, it's not like we're saying you have to teach this at this certain grade. It's just, here's where it might make sense, and then if it's going to happen at this grade, that's just fine to switch it around and move it around and things like that.
The Oregon Computer Science Teachers, no, the Computer Science Teachers Association, OSTO, whatever the acronym is, they're actually creating a playbook that helps to do exactly that.
Beautiful.
It's not completed yet, but
that's
I'll make sure I
great.
send it to
Thank
you
you.
so that you can check
Yeah,
it out.
good, because that's the kind of cross-pollination that I just definitely want us to do with any of these things that are based on national standards. Because again, why reinvent the wheel? And if we can add value to it and pass it back and whatever else that way, that's part of the power of the whole approach. Yeah.
So Dennis, you know I preach integration all the time.
Yes.
So if you have any influence with the computer science folks in terms of moving that framework into a scope and sequence, there is no way in the world that I'm going to get every kid to take a computer science class at high school, right?
Yeah.
And so where it's going to fit in is in science and computational thinking and over here in math and doing this and in social studies and so how to help get that
connecting the dots and
connecting the dots because teachers don't know how to connect the dots.
Yeah. No, and actually that's Shannon and I have had many discussions about that. That's a big concern of hers too, is that because it's so content specific at the high school level, it misses out in my mind and hers too. Putting words in her mouth, but I'm sure she would say that of the opportunities for that cross-pollination. There are logical ways within doing algorithms within math that are absolutely straight out of the CS standards that you don't need to be taking a CS course to do. And so it's way too easy to say, well, CS belongs over there in CTE or somewhere else, and it's not my issue at all, and lose.
Or have a board member who says we're now going to make it graduation.
Yes, right. Yeah, yes.
Everybody takes a coding course.
Exactly.
Not even a CS course, but a coding course.
Yeah.
We're facing the same thing in Oregon.
Oh, yeah.
Part of it is we brought them in as we worked on the ISTE Standards for development, and we see they even see the ISTE Standards as overarching. However, when we have a school that has two teachers, or one teacher, like many of ours do, in our rural areas, there's no way you can add the computer science everything that's in the computer science standards for
Yeah.
that. So we have not adopted the CSK-12 because once we adopt it, it becomes required instruction, and boy, that's half we don't even want to go there right now. But we're going to use the CSK-12 to support operationalization of the ISTE standards.
Good. Yeah, great. Other thoughts or questions? How many of your districts have TOSAs or tech specialists? Yeah, all right. Yeah. All right. Good. That's nice. Yeah. How many of you have teacher librarians?
But not full time.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. I'm just asking the general question at the moment here. Yeah. Because I think those are certainly two key places to be starting at least some of these conversations and stuff. Yeah. Good. All right. Well, thank you. I'll be around if you have additional questions and stuff. But
and then to help people understand, there's the next session, which starts at 3:45. There's a Washington State update here in this room, and then Carla is moving herself to Zigzag to do an Oregon update. So Dennis was actually the one that volunteered initially, and we drug Carla into it and said, let's do a competing time when both EdTech directors can be around and answer questions as well as present as to what's going on.
And I promise to cover some different things then.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, yeah. Oh, yeah, thanks.